Hello and welcome to another episode of Data Lounge, where we try to take a look at the more interesting, funny side of data. I'm your host, Alejandro. Hopefully all of you are okay and your families and your loved ones are doing okay on these very difficult times for all of us. Hopefully you're safe at home or wherever you are watching this. Don't forget to wash your hands nowadays. So today we're going to continue what we started in our previous solo episode. Okay, so what we started last time was, hey, what do I do in the cloud when I start for the first time? And we saw exactly how with only an Outlook.com account we go. We have our first interaction with what Azure is all about. We also took a look at what kind of things, very, very briefly, how it all looks in that thing called the Azure portal. And today we're going to start creating the very first object within that big data center that is Azure for all of us. Okay. So I'm basically coming now to the login area. Remember portal.azure.com, right? And it's asking me to sign in right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sign in with my demo user, okay? And that demo user is going to be, let's go with this one. Perfect, at Data Lounge, on Microsoft.com. Perfect, admin demo, good. We do next here. Perfect. It's asking me for the password here. All right, perfect. So this is the Azure portal, right? But we have nothing right now. It's telling me yes, you have some credit. That's okay. If I come here and I say, hey, show me the resources, right, or the kind of things that I might have. So we're gonna go to this thing called All Resources, and we see that there is absolutely nothing here. Okay, we have absolutely nothing right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to start creating resources. Okay, so what is this idea of resources? So basically everything within Azure is a resource. Okay, anything that provides either computing capability, either storage, either networking, is something that within the Azure, the Microsoft Azure world is called a resource. Okay. However, before we try to create resources, we need to create something called resource groups. So the logic of this is basically that you create resources, but resources on their own are not really that valuable. Very probably you will want to group them, representing either a business process, representing either a new project that you're starting, representing probably an environment. So it's very, very common to see this concept of a resource group to be used to separate the development environment from the test environment, or the production environment, or the QA environment, right? So this is exactly the first thing we're going to do. So we're going to come to resource groups, okay? And they're just simply about, so we're going to see that they're basically empty, and there is nothing really with them. But we will see certain security aspects. We're gonna have another episode when we begin to talk a little bit more about security and some other elements here within this brand new Azure world. Okay, so we see that there is nothing. It says no resource groups to display whatsoever. So we're going to say create resource group. Then we have our subscription. This is the free trial that we've been working with, that we all know, right? So we're going to create a resource group, and it's going to be called the Sql group. Okay, and obviously on the region, we're going to say, in our case, this is United UK South. Europe, UK South, perfect. And you see that that's it, okay? That's everything that it's asking us here. I'm gonna say, actually, this is a SQL resource group, so I don't get confused myself later, right? So we're gonna come here. It's asking us about tags. What are tags? Tags are basically, and probably if you work with other types of technology, something like GitHub, for instance, tags are basically small labels that we put on objects. Okay, these small labels will be very, very, very useful when we're already managing our server. So if we're thinking about the data center, right, and we're coming from that world, in a data center, it's very common when we go to the racks and we're playing with the servers that we put the small pieces of paper, right, indicating something. So this is the cabin, or this is the configuration for this network part here, for this hub here, for this router there. So tags are exactly that. Think of these tags here as small pieces of paper that we're putting on our data center. Advantage of this is that we will be able to query these tags, and we will be able to use these tags for billing and expense purposes. We're going to take a look at in some other of our episodes to that expense concept and the billing part of the cloud. Okay. So for now, we're not going to put any tags. We're going to go simply to next, review and create. We see, yes, we're creating a SQL resource group in UK South, and that's it. So I'm going to click on create. Done. Almost instantaneous. Okay. I'm going to close this. I'm going to say refresh. And it will take a moment to come. Hopefully. Click go to resource group. There we go. Yeah. So we have nothing within the resource group itself, right? It's just a container. We see that it has quite a few properties to the left. Okay, we're going to start creating objects, and then we will talk about many of these things here. What is important for us to know is that this is the concept, or this is something that you will see a lot in the documentation, which is the concept of a blade, right? What is the blade of the resource? So basically, a blade is any of these things. So you see here, activity log, that's part of the blade. Access control, that's another blade, and so on, so on, so on. So for our resource group, quickly, let's take a look here. The overview, we have nothing. We're going to create now a SQL Server, right? If we come from the data world, very probably the first thing that we associate mentally ourselves with is, hey, I need a SQL, right? I want a database that I want to work with. So let's create a SQL Server database. Let's see what's the experience here. So I'm going to come to add. And this is the place where we start shopping, right? So this is basically the experience, pretty much like any web store, where we can say, you know what, I want a SQL, or I want a web application, or I want a Kubernetes, or I want any of those crazy things that we can find in the cloud. So let's start with the basics. Let's say, hey, I want to see what do you have about SQL. And it's giving me a lot of things, right? So let's say, hey, give me something called SQL database, okay? We're starting with the concept of SQL because it's the one that will help us get acquainted with this in a smooth fashion. Okay, so notice here that I'm saying let's go with the SQL database. I'm not saying give me a SQL server, right? So let's say, hey, what happens when I want a SQL database? So I'll go here. Okay, I'd say, oh, okay, you want to create a SQL database. Okay, good. So we have a subscription, we have a resource group, right? We could choose one, or we could create a new one. We're gonna simply use the one that we already have, okay? And in database name, right, we're going to create our database. So we're gonna say Adventure Works empty. This is gonna be our empty database, okay? And it's asking us about server. You say, oh, a server, let's create a new one. So let's come here. And we'll see to the right that is giving us the option to specify the server name, okay? So the server name, in our case, we're gonna put simply SQL Server, okay? Now, in the cloud, in reality, we don't use the concept of SQL Server. We're going to see that it's a little bit of an artifact. It's not as transparent as we would like it to be, okay? So it's basically saying right now, you see that it's performing validations. Hey, server name should not contain reserved words, but also your server name can only contain lowercase letters, numbers, and dash. So in our case, then we're going to change this, and we're going to say SQL Server. It says it's already in use within the domain. We see here a specified server name is already in use. So we're going to call it SQL Server Data Launch. There we go. So it's asking us for an admin login right now. Let's see what happens if we put the admin word here, okay? And you see again another check. It's saying, no, don't use admin because it's very common. And from a security point of view, one of the things that can be done on security view is probing, right? It's trying to connect to SQL Server instances around the world with very common usernames. So in our case, obviously, because this is just a demo, we're going to call it SQL Alejo admin. There we go. Okay, we're gonna put the password here. Confirm the password, and it's telling me, hey, where do you want that server to be, right? So I'm going to say here, UK South. We'll want it in the same place. Okay, and you can see immediately that there doesn't seem to be necessarily a link between where do I want my database versus where do I want my server. So I'm going to click here for a moment. There we go. Okay, perfect. And now what we see here is just you have a database that is empty. We have a SQL Server Data Launch server, and it's saying want to use SQL Elastic Pool. So for now, we're going to say no, because before we start talking about the Elastic Pools, we need to get acquainted with some other concepts here. And it's telling me, whoa, compute and storage, and it's saying you can use the standard. Okay, so let's have this conversation a little bit. So let's go to this configure database for a moment, and let's see what do we have available. Okay. So when we're talking about SQL Server database, Microsoft is giving us different versions. So the equivalent to what we used to have in the on-premises world, where we would be able to say, hey, I want the standard edition or I want the enterprise edition. In the cloud is effectively this we're seeing here on the screen, okay? So we have two flavors of this in the cloud. We have the scenario of basic, standard, and premium. We don't have premium here right now. And in basic, you see that we have something called the DTUs, okay? DTUs are the units which are basically a correlation between an amount of memory and an amount of CPU power to be able to deal with a particular workload, okay? DTUs are not necessarily that straightforward to work with, because obviously if we're coming from the on-premises world, we're much more used to say, okay, I want to know exactly the memory, I want to know exactly the CPU that I'm gonna get. So this model might not necessarily be the closest to what we want to work with, or the one we want to be acquainted with at the beginning. So we're going to move to something called the B Core based purchasing options. And in this case, in this configuration, we have the option to say, okay, good. We have two flavors here. We have, well, at the beginning, we have general purpose, we have hyperscale and business critical. Let's go with general purpose. Let's take it step by step. And it's saying, hey, this is the IOPS, and now we're beginning to hear a little bit of a language that we're a little bit more familiar with, right? So we're talking about input-output operations per second, and a bit of latency, and the latency that we can expect here. And it says, hey, you have two flavors within the general purpose. You have the compute tier, which is provisioned, right? In the provisioned world, what we have is you have your resources pre-allocated, whatever, how many CPUs, how many vCores, how much memory you have allocated. You have it, it's yours, that's it. Or you can have the serverless one, where basically on the serverless one it's provision based on the moment of the request. So a little bit of just-in-time provisioning, basically. And obviously there are differences between the two. In the case of provision, it's built per hour. In the case of serverless, it's built per second. So for now, let's go with provisioned, okay? And it says, hey, in the compute hardware, we can have a specific hardware configuration. So let's go and see what kind of options we have, okay? And we say, yes, we have a maximum generation 5, which is a balance. Microsoft calls this a balance between memory and compute, with a maximum of up to 80 virtual cores, maximum 400 gigabytes of memory, and maximum storage 4 terabytes, right? But if you have been working, or you've been hearing a little bit to the people from IT talking about virtual machines in the cloud or infrastructure as a service, probably you will hear that they're talking about the M series or the FS series, and so on and so on. So the series are basically virtual machine configurations in the cloud for a specific workload. In this case, Microsoft is offering here as well the FSV2 series, which is compute optimized, where the number of cores is a little bit lower, but obviously the memory is way, way smaller. So the ratio between virtual cores and memory is way, way higher. Okay, and also saying, hey, this is the maximum storage, and this is the compute cost per core per month. So the immediate question, so let me click cancel here. I'm going to stick to generation 5, okay? And the next question is, whoa. So do I really need to provision like 80 cores and all that memory that I was seeing before, all those 400 gigs? The answer is no. Okay, so once we have selected or chosen a particular hardware configuration, we can say, hey, how many cores do I want to start with? And what is the maximum data size I'm going to have? Okay, so we can say here, yeah, I want to start with 16. I want to start with 32, or I want to start only with 2 cores, right? So let's start small. Let's go with 2 virtual cores. And here we're specifying the maximum data size, or in other words, how much data we're going to be storing here. Right now here, in this particular layer in general purpose, we have a limitation of 4 terabytes as maximum volume. But don't worry, very probably if you have larger volumes than that, there is another way, another flavor of SQL. That's another part of the conversation we're going to have throughout this series, where we're going to see that we have basically very large number of terabytes available besides those 4 terabytes. For now, let's say, hey, I'm going to have something small. It's 32 gigabytes of data size, and the cost of that is a total per month of 325 pounds in our case here in the United Kingdom. Okay, so let's say yes, I'm gonna go with the generation 5, only 2 V cores, and I'm gonna click apply. There we go, generation 5, 2 V cores, 32 gigabytes of storage. And once I have selected all that, I can move on to the next step, which is asking me about networking. Okay, in our case, for our exercise, we're going to say simply this is a public endpoint. Okay, you see here that we have the private endpoint. The private endpoint option is for something called a virtual network, which we can basically think of it as a private connectivity option. So for now, for our learning purposes, we're going to stick with public network, and we're going to leave these options as they are. We're going to talk about this in another time. So we go with public endpoint, we leave everything else as it is. It asks for additional settings. It says data source, hey, start with a blank database or restore from a backup, or select sample data to populate your new database. Let's say we're gonna leave it, let's leave it empty. Let's go with empty. Database collation, this is extremely important. Obviously, if you're coming from the database world, you know how significant this is. Obviously, in this case, we're gonna leave the default, only for our examples. Advanced data security, I'm gonna say no, not now. Again, because we are creating a resource, it's asking us about tags again, which we're not gonna put anything. And here we have the summary of what we're going to use. Okay, so don't forget that now we have here the estimated cost per month. Okay, so in this case it's 300 pounds per month. So we're going to come here and we're going to say, hey, create. And what we see here is another new concept, which is called the deployments. So deployments are basically all the operations that imply creating a new resource in Azure. That concept of creating something in Azure is called provisioning, the term that the geeks are using right now, is provisioning a resource in the cloud. So when you talk about provisioning, it's exactly this thing that we're doing right now. It's exactly taking a piece and saying, yes, I want a SQL Server database, so let's create one in the cloud. Very interesting about this concept of the deployments, and this is probably the very first time we're seeing this, is that we're able to see the details of this specific deployment. So if I come here to the operation details, it's telling me exactly how long it's lasting. So we see the internal name of the operation, create, the status, how long it's been since we triggered it. So it's giving us a very, very interesting perspective of what's going on. Here we can see it's saying, yes, accepted, okay, created. So we can see here that it was first creating the SQL Server, right, the server that we mentioned, before proceeding to create the individual database. So we're going to give it a few more moments here until this finishes. While it's doing this, yes, it accepted the request now. The other thing that we can see here is the concept of input. So let's take a look here at the input. So we can see here all the parameters that it's using for the creation. we can see if there were any deployment outputs. And in this case, and for a few other resources, we're going to have something called the templates. So the templates is something related to another element within Azure called the Azure Resource Manager, which is basically a language to manage resources in an automated way. We're not going to talk about those right now in this data lounge, but just so you know, that's something that we will be covering. There are some very interesting options there, but we're not going to be talking about those right now. So if I come here to the overview of the deployment, I see, yes, deployment complete. Okay, great. I have nothing to do. Deployment details, everything okay. So perfect. I can just go home. We go to the resource groups now. There we have a SQL resource group. And there I'm able to see my SQL Server and my database. Okay. So what we're going to do right now is, okay, great. So I have this thing. How do I connect to this, right? How do I see the data? How do I work with it? Because of course, if we're in the on-premises world, it would say, okay, yes, someone installed the server on a machine, or you installed the server on a virtual machine. So how do I connect to this? Okay. So what we're going to do right now is let's take an exploration, very quick exploration to the server first. Okay. So we have our SQL Server quotes. Okay. And we see quite a few interesting aspects here. We're not going to talk about all of these here. Don't worry. The idea today is that we are able to connect to a SQL Server Relational in the cloud. So we see that there is a server here, and we see a few other things on the blades to the left. So if we could take a look at SQL databases, we're able to see, yes, we have our AdventureWorks empty, which is online, and it's the pricing tier, the configuration that we had decided before. So I'm going to come here to our AdventureWorks empty, and here we have all the information related to that specific database. Okay, we could start by the beginning here and say, hey, there is something called the query editor. So we would be able to come to the query editor. Okay, and you see that it's automatically giving me the SQL Server authentication, right? For the user that we created before. So I'm going to try to connect to it. There we go. What's going on? It says cannot open server, SQL Server, blah, 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 client with the IP address, blah. Okay, so it's basically telling me that because of the network I'm connected to right now, I cannot connect to this. So how do we deal with this problem? Because obviously I might have the login, I might have the password, but not working for us. So what we can do here, or what we should do here if we want to be able to connect, is obviously it seems that it's not allowed in the server, right? So we're going to come to the instance right now. I'm going to return. I'm going to my SQL Server group. I'm going to my server. Okay. And in the server, you will see that we have something called firewalls and virtual networks. Okay. So in these firewall and virtual networks, we're going to say, I want to allow access to these servers. Okay. So I can come here, say yes, and I can add here my client IP address. I'm just going to put this here. I'm going to copy this one. So it's very convenient because it's already giving us the IP address that we're using for this connection. So there we go, because of course I have a space at the beginning. There we go with this one. And this is going to be Alejo connection. There we go. Okay, so in this moment, this is the IP address. I'm going to save this. There we go. So it's saved now. I'm going to go back now to my SQL database, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'll go to my database. I'll try my query editor. I'm going to try to put the password in. Hopefully this works. Ta-da! We're able to access. Okay. So this is probably one of the first things that will get us in trouble a little bit. So here what we have is a very quick web interface to query this database if we were to have something. Obviously, we can run queries directly, so we can do select star from sys.tables, for instance. We can run the query, and as it says, query succeeded, affected rows 0, because obviously we have no tables here right now. I can say, as I said, let's do it the old-fashioned way, which we should not be having any kind of code like this anymore, right? And you can see that, hey, we are returning all the objects that we would have in a traditional SQL Server database. And I want to highlight that, okay? So this is SQL Server database right now. So perfect, yes, okay. I can see the editor, I can explore the tables, the views, and the procedure, but obviously this is telling me, hey, if you really want the capabilities, go to SQL Server Data Tools, right? It's actually not necessarily only SQL Server Data Tools, so don't allow yourself to be confused by that. Right now, what we're going to do is I'm going to use our own very well loved and known SQL Server Management Studio to connect to it. So what we're going to do right now is I'm going to come to the overview of the database. Yes, I will discard the results of the query, that's not a problem. And here we have the server name. So this is what we're going to use to connect to this database. So I'm going to copy this to the clipboard and saying, yes, SQL Server Data Launch. And I'm going to say, yeah, new connection to the database engine. And I'm going to paste it directly, okay? The next step is saying, yes, our authentication, right? So for authentication, we're going to use SQL Alejo admin with the password that we know. I'm going to click on connect. All right, good. So right now I am connected to the server, okay? And we see that it looks very similar to what we see in our relational traditional on-premises database. I have one here already. So I have an AdventureWorks. This one is not empty. But we can compare how they look like. So we have AdventureWorks DW 2017, and here we have pretty much the same object. We have database diagrams, tables, views, etc., etc., etc. Now, one of the things that we're not seeing, and this is what I want to bring your attention to right now, is that we're not seeing some of the other server elements. So we have here in the cloud, we have the databases, obviously, we have security, we have integration services, catalogs, but we don't see things here like management, which we do see in the on-premises world. The reason for this, and this is probably one of the most confusing elements at the beginning, is that when we're talking about the server in the cloud, it's a little bit of simply a face, simply a ghost of the traditional instance that we are familiar with. In the cloud, actually, for this scenario that we're working with right now, the main unit of provisioning is the database, the individual database as such, okay? So if you're looking for things like, for instance, the SQL Server Agent, we don't have the SQL Server Agent in a SQL database. However, so you might say, oh, but Alejandro, what can I do if I actually have a scenario where I want to migrate a full server? I don't want to migrate only one database. I want to explore what can I do to move a whole server or a whole instance of Relational Engine that has 4 or 5 different databases. So if you need to do something like that, then there is another flavor of SQL Server in the cloud that is known as SQL Managed Instance. So Managed Instance, a completely different product compared to what we have here. But the advantage of Managed Instance is that it's actually a closer representation of the concept of instance that we're familiar with in the SQL Server on-premises world. However, majority of the workloads, if we're talking about re-engineering our skills and our abilities and our knowledge, most of the work is done in the under the concept of individual databases, okay? Obviously, there are massive managed instances around with multiple organizations using them, but they're mainly tailored for scenarios of migration where you need you have additional dependencies in terms of the code that you're writing and that trigger, for instance, jobs in the SQL Server Agent, okay? So let's come back here to our database. So we have our database. We can obviously run queries. So let's do some of those basic operations here. Perfect. As you were in AdventureWorks empty, right? So we can do something like create table demo, or like this, people, right? And our table people is gonna be person ID, I'm gonna make this a little bit bigger, person ID, this is gonna be an integer with an identity, 11, and we can create NA, person name, this is gonna be a varchar 40, and we can obviously create a person last name, let's do the age, for instance, age, it's gonna be an integer. So let's execute this. Of course, sorry about this. Let's do it, there we go. And of course we can do select star from people, and you can see we have IntelliSense working as well. There we go, execute. Obviously we have nothing here, but obviously we would be able to insert data, exactly the same operation, very, very close to what we have in terms of the relational engine, but right now, obviously connected to the cloud. Right now, everything you're seeing here, we have a server, we have an instance running somewhere, in a data center somewhere, that is bringing us all the power of the relational engine that we're familiar with. So for today, this is all we wanted to cover. So we started very quickly, very quick summary of what we've done today. We started with an empty subscription. We started with an empty Azure portal. We created and we understood a little bit what's the concept of that, what's that idea of resource group. We talked about resources. We provisioned our first SQL Server database in the cloud. We also provisioned the concept of a server, and we're definitely going to spend much more time on that. And we were able to actually trigger a couple queries and run a couple queries in the cloud for the first time. So that's great. So thank you very much for joining us on this episode of Data Lounge. In our next episode, hopefully more interesting stuff for you. Thank you for joining us. Keep safe, wash your hands, wear your masks, be healthy. Thank you, everyone. See you next time. And if you like this, please don't forget to subscribe. Laura is gonna put something here, hopefully somewhere. Thank you, everyone. See you next time.